As you all know by now, the theme of the Jubilee is Pilgrims of Hope. So Pope Francis is trying to get us, or the Church is trying to encourage us to focus on hope rather than on despair or desperation or the problems that the world has. So we're really focusing on hope, and we're trying to see what hope we can have when we're looking at care for our common home. Very many young people, particularly looking at the state of the planet, have a sense of despair or despondency, and they kind of get depressed about the state of the planet. So I'm going to give or share with us, and I'm sure many of you have your own ideas, which we'll be very happy to hear in the question time at the end. You have your own ideas about the state of the planet, the state of our common home. And so we'll talk about that. So I'm going to look at that, and then right at the end, I'm going to give us some pointers. Normally you ask me questions, but this evening I'm going to turn the tables a bit, and I'm going to ask you questions. What are we doing to make this world a hopeful world for the generations that are following us? As I'm looking at the participants at the moment, most of you, like me, are full of gray hair. So the question is, how are we going to give hope to the young people who are following after us? As usual, these lectures are offered by the Jesuit Institute in South Africa in collaboration with the Jesuit province of South Africa, our social apostolate desk. I've divided the lecture series into the lecture today into 5 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so this is just to give you an idea of the shape of our talk. I'm going to try and finish in 45 minutes so that we have 10 minutes at the end of the session for questions and answers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections. Let's move straight on to section number 1, looking at the reality.
Sorry, Peter, you're not sharing with us.
Oh.
Your slides.
Oh. Are they showing now?
Yes, there we are. Now we can see them. Perfect.
Okay, thanks. So this is where we began, just an idea of who we are, what we're doing. This is the structure, sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're starting immediately with section number 1. What's the reality of pollution in our world today? And many of us have grown up, and many of us have traveled around the world or in specific places in the world, and we've become aware as we observe our earth. We just look out the motor car window or out, when we're walking around, land, water, air, noise pollution, light pollution, sewage, and especially the one that's in people's minds these days is plastics and persistent organic pollutants. That's POPs. Let's have a look at pollution on the land. The photograph you have in front of you was taken by a colleague of mine in Tembisa. And this is the market in Tembisa, and the back of the market, you'll see their pollution in plastic bags. I mean, people throw their junk in plastic bags. At least they're not sort of flying all over the place. But there's also junk on the roof of these market stalls. And Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, published in 2015, talks about the way we see the earth, the way we perceive our earth. He says the earth, our home, is looking more and more like an immense pile of filth. In many parts of the planet, the elderly people like me and some of us here lament that once beautiful landscapes are now covered with rubbish. And I'm sure if you sort of go back in your own memory, you'll remember where things used to be cleaner and clearer and more beautiful than they are now. So Pope Francis makes this observation. And so I'm going through land, water, everything like that. In some places in Africa, the water is polluted to such an extent that you cannot drink it. Most notoriously is the Niger Delta, where for the last 50 years, oil pipelines have been leaking oil, which has contaminated the surface of over 1,000 square kilometers of water. So in the Niger Delta, the major river in West Africa, people can't grow, people can't bring their livestock to the water anymore. Nothing can give life in that water. It's just so toxic, it kills everyone. When I was in Kenya for the last almost 10 years, Oil was discovered in a part of the country called Turkana, which is in the northeast. It's very dry. It's an arid land. They discovered oil and they discovered an aquifer 3 kilometers down. And a French company moved in and they started exploiting and exploring for oil. And very, very quickly, the aquifer got polluted with the oil. And so the water is very saline, so it's not really good for human consumption. But that aquifer is not productive now. It's not helpful. If we come to South Africa, we know our own Karoo is a very arid region as well. Thousands of square kilometers of the aquifer under the Karoo could be potentially polluted for decades if the oil companies in South Africa and if parts of our government in South Africa have their way and they start fracking, which is kind of pumping water into the shale to release or to force out of the shale underground gas, which will then kind of theoretically be contained and then used as a fossil fuel. But if fracking does begin, then the Karoo is pretty well ruined. The fracking itself requires millions and millions of liters of water, and how will that fracking be sourced in a very arid landscape, which is the Karoo? So that's water pollution. We've also seen in our rivers, often we see plastic junk floating on our rivers, and plastic is very durable, and it'll sit there for months and months and years until somebody actually makes the effort to remove it. In our rivers as well, there's runoff from agriculture, fertilizers runoff that leads to algal blooms or blooms, as we know, on the Vaal River of water lettuce or on the Hartbeespoort Dam of hyacinth. And those blooms of plant life deprive the aquatic life of oxygen, and therefore things die and sink to the bottom. In the Vaal River, near the city of Parys, for example, there's industry and sewage, which is just being pumped into the Vaal River. And then that obviously diminishes the value of the Vaal River as a place where people go and have rituals and baptism liturgies. And so the Vaal River is losing its cultural value as well as losing its value to support life. And so we have to be very, very careful. We have to be aware that it's not just, pollution isn't just about making life difficult, it's about making life less valuable from a cultural point of view. There's so many different sources of water pollution. And so this is a graphic, obviously I didn't make it myself, from landfill sites. So from rubbish dumps, pollution gets pumped from factories, from farms, from agriculture, from domestic places, residential places, from vehicles. Acid mine drainage, acid mine seepage is a big thing in South Africa. We don't have so much mariculture. We don't really grow fish or farm fish as they do in many other parts of the world. But there's pollution from all these different sources which come into surface water, say the rivers or the sea, or they come into our aquifers. And then the groundwater is polluted and is not really suitable for use for agriculture or for drinking again. Air pollution is less visible sometimes than land and water pollution. The United Nations Environmental Programme calls air pollution Africa's invisible silent killer. This author writes that in Africa, the increasing level of urbanization exposes people to much more air pollution as they live in congested inner cities like in Kibera or Kangemi, or in South Africa, Soweto or Alexandra. People are exposed to indoor air pollution if they're using biomass fuels such as dung or wood, or kind of even people burning plastics which happens in South Africa, where people can't afford to buy any other source of fuel. They're exposed to black carbon, or which from burning fossil fuels. Are they exposed to this type of pollution? I've written in the footnote here what it refers to. PM 2.5 pollutants is very, very fine pollution which gets into people's respiratory systems. Ursula, who's chairing the meeting, her husband Martin, is very, very, he's made his entire career in monitoring and making recommendations for clean air. We have Fisher and Al writing in the Lancet journal. They maintain that in Africa, household air pollution is the predominant form of air pollution, but household air pollution is decreasing, whereas ambient air pollution is increasing. That ambient air pollution comes from transport, from people burning diesel, comes from our power stations and things like that. And as ambient air pollution increases, that's going to increase morbidity. People's lifespans will be shortened, and that will make them less productive, obviously, if people are not alive anymore. I saw this article in the Daily Maverick today. It's not an April Fool's joke, it's real, that for the next 5 years, seven power stations in Mpumalanga have been granted an exemption from the Air Quality Act. And one has been granted a 9-year exemption from the Air Quality Act. And so people living around these power stations, these 8 power stations in Mpumalanga province, that's in the eastern part of South Africa, people living close to those, and in fact also people living at some distance from these power stations, they're breathing air which is laden with the pollution, with the emissions from the smokestacks. You know, South Africa burns a lot of coal. Most of our electricity comes from the combustion of coal, which then produces carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and many kind of pollutants which affect the health of people living in the immediate area and some distance away from the coal power stations. Noise pollution is frequently overlooked in Africa. Many people think, oh, that's just a fact of life. When I was living in Nairobi, you'd hear the generators switching on, and apart from all the carbon monoxide being put out by the generators, you've just got this noise all around you for hours and hours and hours. When people are constantly bombarded by sound, it can cause serious cognitive and cardiovascular health problems. It can disturb your sleep. I don't sleep very heavily, so sleep impairment doesn't make me a cheerful person in the morning. It can impair their hearing if it's really loud, and it impairs their work and school performance. The World Health Organization writes that impairment of early childhood development and education caused by noise may have lifelong effects on the academic achievement of children and on their health as they grow up. So noise pollution is an issue. You can't just block your ears all the time. And there's a website I saw in South Africa. This is a property development group. They are giving people advice on how to deal with noisy neighbors. There's also light pollution. In Africa, many lumens of unnecessary light burn all night across the continent. And so that has implications for birds, for example, migratory birds or birds which are kind of traveling around at night. They fly into buildings where they see the lights are on. And many prey animals, so the little rats and the smaller animals, are much more visible to nocturnal predators. And so nocturnal predators hunting success increases because they can see better the prey animals. There's mounting evidence as well that humans are adversely affected by artificial light at night. And so humans, their sleep patterns are disrupted, their physiological problems, their behavioral rhythms are interrupted as people sleep less and they have longer exposure to daylight or to light. Pope Francis also talks about another form of light pollution, which he calls visual pollution. He says in many cities, all people see is cement, asphalt, glass, and metal. And Francis, and junk, of course, the junk you referred to in part 21 of Laudato Si, we've mentioned that already. And this visual pollution means that people are deprived of contact with greenery and nature and the calming effect and the humanizing effect that contact with nature and greenery give to people. Here's a map of the world. This is taken from 2023, so it's 2 years old. It's like a representation of night lights. So if you live in the eastern part of the United States, or if you live in Central Europe, you'll be exposed to all of this night light. And the red is obviously the most intense night light. And here in Southern Africa, if we look at, this is the Gauteng province, this region here, and then along the east coast, so all the way down what we call the south coast and Cape Town, we've got vast areas where people are exposed to light at night. And that has effects on hormonal cycles. It has effects on people's sleep patterns and things like that. Then the final form of pollution that I'd like to look at is plastic pollution and persistent organic pollutants. Plastic is ubiquitous, it is everywhere. It's growing, there's becoming more and more of it, and it's a major challenge. They're cheap, they're easily manufactured, they're distributed all over the world, and they're designed to last forever. Plastics are designed, and their advantage is that they can last. They can be packaging or whatever, and they'll be for years and years and years. Basically, there are 7 kinds of plastic with different properties of strength, durability, weight, and flexibility. And they obviously use different, they're designed to meet different applications. Once they've been used once, plastics can be recycled. Some plastics can be recycled and sorted into their basic polymeric structures. And in that, the basic polymers are reused in other plastic products. But the recycling process is complex, and in many African countries, it's too expensive. In South Africa, we have fairly developed plastic recycling. In many other African countries, it doesn't exist. And so it's cheaper simply to get rid of plastics by burning them or just discarding them onto the landscape or into rivers once it's fulfilled the use for which it was manufactured. Plastics do break down under the action of water, sunlight, and movement, and they ultimately form microplastics. That's pieces of plastic about 5 millimeters in diameter, in length. And these get eaten by animals, which confuse them for food because of the size or the shape or the color. And so very often, and I'm sure we've all seen pictures of this, very often animals end up with plastic all the way through their digestive tract, and that blocks the movement of any other food in the digestive tract. And so many animals can die from the accumulation of plastics, or animals can die from the infections on microbes which piggyback on the plastics. These microbes, germs, bacteria, viruses have found a home on the rough surfaces of the plastics, and they then come into the digestive tracts of many animals. Let's move on to section 2. Section 2 is just 2 questions from the study of anthropology. Pollution is a concrete thing. We've just looked at the reality of pollution, but pollution also has meaning. It also has kind of things which it says to people and things that it communicates to people. So we start with a very early definition of what pollution is, or in fact what dirt is. Mary Douglas, a British anthropologist, was looking at cultures, and she was looking at African cultures in particular, and asking what is pollution in the context of ritual. Pollution, or dirt, she says, is matter which is out of place. Matter itself is not dirty. This mouse is not dirt, okay? It's not dirt in itself. It's got a use, it's got a place on my desk. The minute I throw it out in the street, then it becomes pollution. It's regarded as dirt. So dirt, matter of itself is not dirty, but it becomes dirt when it's not in the place which is assigned to it, that is, on my desk. It disturbs patterns and it creates disorder. If this mouse is in the middle of Molesey Road, people are going to drive around it, or people are going to drive over it. It'll crunch and break. The batteries then sort of start leaking acid and things like that. So when something is in its right place, it's fine. When it's out of place, then it's regarded as pollution or dirt. Some types of matter, I'd say, in response to Mary Douglas, shouldn't be there at all. There is no place for example, nuclear waste. It shouldn't be in my backyard. It shouldn't be in your backyard. It shouldn't be in the middle of the Northern Cape. There is no space for nuclear waste. We don't send it to the bottom of the ocean. We shouldn't send it out into space, outer space. Nuclear waste, for example, remains a danger for all life forms wherever it is. So Mary Douglas had this idea in the 1966. 60 years later, the ideas have been refined, and we see kind of the limitedness of Mary Douglas's ideas. And the question is, where is the right place? Dirt and pollution, they have ways of spreading beyond the places which are assigned to them. For example, if you see a city rubbish dump, there's the landfill site, but wind picks up all sorts of junk from the rubbish dump and it travels on the wind. Plastic bags go flapping around all over the place from city rubbish dumps. Dust travels on the wind. Chemicals leach from land and travel down rivers. Plastic rides ocean currents. Methane is released from landfills. So you can't say there's a place and it will stay where it is. Ozone heads to the higher levels of the atmosphere. And as long as we presume there's an inappropriate place for man-made waste, human-made waste, nature is going to thwart us, because with gases, for example, there's Graham's law of diffusion of gases, and nature will just take the matter and put it in some other place where it's not meant to be. For example, going back to our coal-fired power stations in Mpumalanga, so these two smokestacks have got, so these are cooling towers. They're just trying to cool down the water, and the water escapes mostly as steam. And the steam here in the cooling towers on the sides is mostly cleanish water vapor. But the smoke comes from the combustion of the coal, and you can see it's dirty. And it doesn't just stand there at the power station. That smoke drifts hundreds of kilometers sometimes across Mpumalanga province, and if the wind is blowing eastwards, then it blows over Mozambique into the Indian Ocean. So you can't say this pollution is just going to remain where it is. Nature has a way of kind of moving pollution from its designated space. Remaining with our anthropologists, there are various types of activities which are considered to be polluting. And if a person is polluted in this anthropological sense, then he or she may not be qualified to participate in rituals of reconciliation, rituals of coming of age, rituals of kind of theological significance on an annual cycle or something like that. Famously, in the Old Testament, things such as, or events such as menstruation, childbirth, contact with blood, contact with semen, contact with cadavers of animals or corpses of people, or contact with feces, prevented people from entering into sacred cultic spaces. They were polluted and they were not permitted to participate in the community rituals. And sometimes, or often, there are rituals for overcoming the pollution, which then qualify a person to participate in the ritual. And this, Mary Douglas was writing about ritual in the African context, for example, you may remember. And there are echoes in many, many African traditional rituals. There are things that disqualify people from participating in traditional rituals on the African continent. Let's move on to section 3. That's questions about politics and society, economic questions, questions relating to health, relating to illegality, what's legal and what's illegal, pollution and art, pollution and colonialism. And I end up with a kind of somewhat rhetorical question of why white is regarded as the clean color. Pollution and disease. Very often pollution is not visible. It can't be seen. Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, paragraph 20, he highlights the often invisible chemicals which we don't see. Okay, we see the fertilizer, we see it running off, but insecticides are very often gases, or insecticides are very often granules which release gases. Fungicides, herbicides, and other agricultural toxins, they accumulate in the organisms of the animals that consume them or consume the insects that have died or consume the plants which have been fertilized with them. And so these chemicals build up inside the bodies the higher you go up the food chain. Industrial fumes, which we inhale, and smoke coming from indoor smoke, cooking, heating, outdoor smoke, transportation, can often lead to high levels of illness. Pope Francis, you may remember, published Laudato Si in 2015. In the year 2017, that is 2 years after Laudato Si, The Lancet, a very important British medical journal, published its report on health, pollution and health. So 2 years after Pope Francis published, the Lancet Commission published its report on pollution and health. I got 2 quotations. These 2 paragraphs are quotations from the Lancet report. And then the 3rd paragraph here is my own comment on it. Firstly, Landrigan and his colleagues say that pollution is the largest cause, or environmental pollution is the largest environmental cause of disease and premature death, more than HIV/AIDS, more than tuberculosis, more than malaria. They calculated that in the year 2015, 9 million people died prematurely because of pollution. They say that's about 16% of deaths worldwide. That was obviously before the COVID pandemic. Pollution kills more than any wars and other forms of violence. In the most severely affected countries, pollution-related disease is responsible for 1 death in 4. That is more than 25%. And Landrigan and his colleagues go on to say that pollution disproportionately kills the poor and the vulnerable. Nearly 92% of pollution-related deaths occur in low-income and middle-income countries. And in countries at every income level, disease caused by pollution is most prevalent among minorities and in the marginalized population groups. Children are at high risk of pollution-related diseases, and even low exposures to pollutants during windows of vulnerability while they're still in the uterus. So fetuses exposed to pollution or early infants, young infants, can result in disease, disability, and death across their entire lifespan. We've heard of fetal alcohol syndrome, and we know that young children, fetuses that have been exposed to alcohol, and that's basic ethanol, they have all sorts of developmental difficulties and very often early death. So this is my comment there. Pollution is not blind to the victims in its selection of victims. Very often those who are at the intersections of poverty or a minority status or vulnerability or advanced age or old age or childhood, they're most likely to fall prey to negative effects of pollution in their environment. In addition, Landrigan, so the Lancet Commission, points out that pollution endangers planetary health. So it's not just humans, but the health of animals and plants around it. Pollution destroys ecosystems, and it's intimately linked to global climate change. So that's the Lancet Commission. There are about 5,000 commonly produced chemicals since the 1950s, and maybe half or fewer than half of them have actually been tested for safety or toxicity. So that means that we're encountering pollution chemicals every day, many of which have never been tested for safety or toxicity. And then obviously pollution, nuclides from radioactivity, so that's in power stations or nuclear weapons, or even in the medical world, they kind of cause health issues. Heavy metals like lead, chemicals like asbestos or DDT or chlorofluorocarbons, polychlorinated biphenyls, they've left a trail of destruction on human health over decades. and they've accumulated in the environment. That's evidence. My little comment on that, for people to flourish and to have life to the full, which Jesus tells us, I've come that we may have life and have it to the full. For people to flourish, conditions need to be conducive to their physical, spiritual, and psychological health. The social, technical, economic, and environmental challenge is to ensure that the waste products which every society produces don't disrupt the organic and mental health of the members or become a burden to the planet on which millions of species of life depend. So we have to find ways of dealing with our waste so that it's not going to become problematic to other people's health or to the health of the planet. Let's jump now to the legal aspect. Many countries are signatories, most countries are signatories to international instruments which are aimed to curb the production and the spread of pollution. Many countries have signed that and made those instruments into law, and they have legislation in the countries concerning the use and disposal of various substances. However, in some countries, and we can name many of them, there is a very weak regime of enforcing the relevant laws relating to pollution. And so pollution proliferates. Even though we've got the laws in our statute books, pollution continues to spread. And that's to the detriment of the health of human beings and to the health of the environment. Art and pollution. Art is meant to disrupt. It's meant to kind of make us think. It's meant to kind of push boundaries, possibly sometimes transgress boundaries. Art is meant to make us sit up and take notice and to begin to think differently. Turning what has been discarded into works of art sometimes illustrates that there is another way of thinking of refuse, stuff that's been discarded. There should be greater circularity in the economy, that objects that we've thrown away can be repurposed or reused. And art shows that we really have to rethink or reposition ourselves within the throwaway culture. I'm sure you've seen and been shocked by people throwing custard on the Mona Lisa, or people spraying tomato sauce on some artworks in Britain, wherever, or in Germany, kind of extinction. Many young people particularly, they really try to make you think and kind of reevaluate your own living in the world by not destroying it. So far, nothing's been destroyed, but by dirtifying paintings which are in art galleries. Personally, I've seen this dhow here, a boat made out of these things, okay, flip-flops, found on the beaches of Kenya. This boat here, a 10-ton boat, is made from discarded flip-flops. And then when I was in Nairobi, this is at the United Nations Environmental Programme, which has its headquarters in Nairobi. This is for their 5th United Nations Environmental Assembly, the 5th one they've ever had in Nairobi. This is all made from junk, from plastic, thrown away plastic. I've seen dolphins made from plastic water bottles, a nice blue dolphin made from plastic water bottles. So this is art which is trying to help us to rethink, what do we do with the stuff we dispose of? There's a question of pollution and colonialism. I've read one book and one article where one is an Inuit, so a North American native person. The other one is a Nigerian, saying pollution is about colonialism. People decide this is where the stuff can be thrown away. This is where the landfill site is going to be. And they're not thinking about this land is sacred to the North American Indians or to the original inhabitants of our part of Africa. Some colonialist has come and said, this is a way we can throw stuff away. This is where we can dispose of stuff. And how do governments decide that? Whom do they consult? Where is going to become the dumping ground for the urban centers, for the industries? And what gives countries in the global north the permission to dump their toxic waste, their organic pollutants, their e-waste in Africa? That's a new form of colonialism. On a similar note, and this is a bit cheeky, tongue-in-cheek, the end of this section, why is white regarded as the clean color? Some of you may find these adverts offensive because they sort of portray women in a particular way. But very often people who are not white themselves, so let's not call them non-whites, people, they think, well, why shouldn't green be portrayed as the clean color, or black? You wear a nice black t-shirt, it's nice and clean. Why should white have become the color that represents cleanliness? So we've done 3 sections so far. Let's go on to section 4 straight away. What is the teaching of the church, and what does Scripture say about pollution? In the Old Testament, as I've mentioned already, pollution had to do with ritual. Pollution also had to do with health, of course. You wash your hands, you wash the vessels from which you're going to eat. Various animals or various food sources, potential food sources, were regarded as unclean. And so they didn't have the idea of microbes. They didn't know about that until the 19th century. But at least in our Old Testament, people are advised against things which could make them unhealthy. And they put that into kind of ritual legislation rather than saying you're going to get a runny tummy if you eat this kind of crayfish or whatever. In the New Testament, writers shift their argument from the external state of the cups and the plates and the hands and the animals to an interior state of the believers. What's their faith like? What are their intentions? What's their charity? What's their morality? So the New Testament, very often we see Jesus, for example, engaging with the religious authorities of his time, formed in what we call the Old Testament. And Jesus says, no, pollution is what comes from inside of one. You can't be made unclean from what comes from outside. He points towards moral cleanliness, spiritual cleanliness, rather than specifically keeping the Jewish law about kosher food and things like that. Paul does something similar in many of his letters, Romans, Titus, etc. He's trying to make the Christian faith more acceptable to people who don't belong to the Jewish tradition. And he's trying to say we don't have to observe the Jewish tradition. So purity then has to do with remaining interiorly pure, not contaminating our faith, not letting it be kind of mixed up with heterodoxy or heresy. We have to be morally pure. And so for Paul, purity has to do with remaining pure in our intentions and in our faith. For James, another one of the early Christian writers, purity of religion requires remaining uncontaminated by the world and helping widows and orphans, so charity. And ultimately for John, in John's first letter, Jesus is the model of purity to which or to whom we should all aspire. Pope Francis mentions pollution 30 times in Laudato Si. That's in about 1 in every 8 paragraphs of Laudato Si. Pope Francis mentions pollution. And the concern is how pollution is affecting people. It's not just about the earth outside of us, but he says we are part of the earth. We're affected by the way pollution affects the earth. It affects us too as human beings. Pollution matters. Very often people are regarded as disposable or discardable in society. And sometimes he says we think of the future people, or we don't think of the future people. We sort of push them to the periphery of our consciousness. We're not concerned about the future. They're sort of out of sight, out of mind. We're not thinking of them. And so he says in paragraph 161 that we may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. So Francis says we have to think about the people now, but the people in the future as well. He calls that intergenerational solidarity. We have to think of the people of the future. He also talks about mental pollution, where we're overloaded with images and information and some toxic messaging. You can just think of what's going on in the United States at the moment and the toxicity in that whole political environment. And Pope Francis says we have to not expose ourselves to that kind of imagery and information. And he frequently encourages people to take time off from the screen. You can do that in 16 minutes time, but I suggest you stay on the screen for the next 16 minutes. Pope Francis says wealthy countries and less wealthy countries, developed countries and less developed countries have differentiated responsibility. Wealthier countries or more industrialized countries have accumulated ecological debt. And this ecological debt includes the disproportionate use of natural resources. Think of all the natural resources that have gone from Africa to the industrialized North over the last 2 centuries. And that they're just using. They contribute to pollution more, to global climate change. They contribute to the export of their own solid waste and their toxic liquids. They offshore polluting industries, so they get nice clean products from the less developed countries. And Pope Francis is asserting, along with the Bolivian bishops, a very well-known principle known as the polluter pays principle. And so he's saying that it's not poorer countries or less developed countries that have to be paying for all of the accumulated global greenhouse gases, for example, of paying for global climate change. It's those countries which have historically accumulated decades, centuries of debt. The final section is hope. We're in this season of hope. We're in this Jubilee Year of Hope. Is hope realistic? Having seen all of those 1, 2, 3, 4 sections that have gone ahead of us, is there realistic hope? I find hope in concrete things. Hope has to be based on something concrete. It's not just a generalized optimism, as Pope Francis tells us in Spe Non Confundit, his bull for the start of this Jubilee year. We don't just hope in the abstract. Hope has to be based on something concrete. And so I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 conventions here, 5 international conventions starting in 1983, going through to 2004, which deal with pollution, specifically dealing with pollution. The International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. It covers oil, noxious liquids, packaged goods, sewage, garbage, and air pollution, both inshore and offshore, so in the deep ocean. That's from 1983. The Basel Convention deals with the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. The Bamako Convention, specifically African Union Convention, bans the import into Africa and controls the transboundary movement of hazardous, including radioactive waste within Africa. The Rotterdam Convention covers the prior informed consent for moving hazardous chemicals and pesticides across borders. And the Stockholm Convention deals specifically with persistent organic pollutants, and therefore it covers a wide range of manufactured organic products. So I think the legal framework and the fact that countries are signing in and committing themselves to these international conventions is a sign of hope. The International Maritime Organization is trying to convince people, you and me, this little poster is 2 years old now, because that convention was 50 years old 2 years ago, and they're saying that yes, the Marpol Convention has made a difference. I think there's hope in what's called the new materialism. It's a newish philosophy which regards the earth, which regards material stuff, matter, as having a voice, as having value, as having being able to make ethical demands. It's not just human beings and our societies which have ethical value. So the new materialism is saying, what's the value, what's the ethical right of material things as well? The cry of the earth. The earth has a voice, the earth has rights, animals have rights. And And so we can ask ourselves, how is our world, the planet, expressing its disapproval at our very anthropocentric behavior, our thinking that the world is all about us? What are extreme weather-related events communicating? Are we listening to Mother Nature? What is Mother Nature saying? And so this material world, what is the material world communicating to us? And I think this is my final, no, it's one more. Prevention and cure. If people are more aware of pollution, and I'd say by and large people are, does that make us more likely to avoid polluting? Does it give us stronger commitments to avoid pollution? Or does that just mean that we find other ways to get around pollution, to infringe the laws in our country? Are there any community-based activities, for example, in your community, clearing up your town, clearing up your stretch of river, or if you're lucky enough to live near a beach, are there community activities clearing up the beach? In your experience, this principle called polluter pays, does it actually work? Does remediation and damages get covered? Do remediation and damages get covered by the real polluter? Do you, as a consumer, refuse to take plastic bags and packaging? Do you carry your own cotton bag or your own backpack so that you don't have to take more plastic? You don't have to bring more plastic home and deal with it yourself. That's a very, very simple activity that we can all do. Your economic activity, is it really circular? Do you think, how do I reduce, reuse, recycle, repurpose many of the things that come into my own household? And then asking ourselves this question, the throwaway culture, the consumer culture, how old, how new are the clothes I wear, the electronics I'm using in front of me, the motor car or the vehicle that I drive, the motorbike that I'm driving? Do I need the newest and the latest? What happens to the old one that I'm no longer using? And then I see some signs of hope, some very slight signs of hope in scientific progress. Pope Francis warns us in Laudato Si that we must not embrace the technological paradigm. We must not say we can solve a problem by using the same logic which created the problem in the first place. So there's that warning that Pope Francis gives us, but there are signs of hope that people are moving to renewable energy and electrical vehicles which use renewable energy rather than using fossil fuels. There seem to be bacteria which will consume or are able to consume a lot of the plastic in the environment. But is this then going to unleash another zoonosis, another thing like a pandemic that we experienced 5 years ago? So we have to be very, very careful of using life forms which can develop a life of their own and get completely out of control. And then organic foods, there's a movement in some circles, those who can afford it, to kind of reject that whole agricultural revolution or the so-called Green Revolution after the Second World War. And they want to return to agricultural food, which uses no added synthetic chemicals. I see these as kind of minor signs of hope. Science is making progress. And I think that's me. I finished now. Ursula, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, you covered a lot of stuff in that 50 minutes, and I think you've given us a lot to think about. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can put the gallery on? There we are. There's a comment from Tony in the chat. There is nevertheless a big focus on the anthropocentric needs. Mother Nature might be saying, can I please be heard? We're also part of the family of families of creation. Animal farm, question mark.
Okay, I think Tony is very correct. If we see ourselves as somehow disconnected from nature, or if we see ourselves as human beings as somehow not part of nature, then we will be disconnected. And we have to see that the concern of the world, Mother Nature, is my concern as well. Mother Nature is my mother. I belong there, and sort of it's not just kind of out there, but I'm part of the world as well. And so Tony, obviously her very specific interest is in families. We're part of a family of families, and human beings are part of the human family created by God, which is not only about kind of natural human families, but we're part of the family of life.
I don't know if anybody else has got any comments or questions. If you'd like to put them in the chat. I have an interesting kind of dilemma that I see on a regular basis, and I'm not really sure how to deal with it. So, for example, where I stay, we travel past a farming community or settlement on a farm. And very often, litter particularly is either just discarded or not put up. There is a collection once a week, and sometimes bags are put out for that. But generally, it's kind of quite people just throw stuff around and discard it wherever. Also, on the way to work, I drive through Mayfair, and the litter on the roads there is horrendous. So it's also linked to socioeconomic status. And the question for me always is how do we deal with this? How do we address something on that kind of level? So you talk about community cleanups, but how do you get communities to really have a buy-in to keeping their own environment tidy and clean?
I've seen this in Jesuit communities and among Jesuits for the last 30 years or more, where they just discard things, and I sort of say, what are you doing there? This is disgusting behavior. Oh no, this is job creation. I'm making work for other people. And I'm sure they never did that in their mothers' homes. It's a question of how much ownership do I have of the space around me?
Yeah.
We've had people who've been so disowned and disenfranchised in our place, in our country, that very often they don't have a sense of ownership of anything other than their backyard. If you go to Rwanda, for example, you go to other parts of the continent, you don't see junk all over the place because people have a greater sense of this is a space for which I'm responsible and where I have some sense of ownership of it. I see there's a question here from Michael. And I mean, very often people are thinking in terms of a circular economy. They're already thinking of the end life of products or how products can be kind of repurposed after their initial use. And so that's already built into the design. Audi, for example, a German motor car manufacturer, has already built into the design of Audis for the last 10 or 15 years what's going to happen to that vehicle at the end of its lifetime, at the end of its useful lifetime. In Germany, with which I'm kind of slightly more familiar than other European countries, people have to pay taxes, or people have to kind of pay to dispose of various things. They can get, as we used to have in South Africa, it doesn't happen much anymore, you can get a deposit back when you return things like bottles, even plastic bottles. You can load all your plastic bottles into a collection space, and then you get cash back. So I think it's part of the redesigning and rethinking of the economy. Economic models have to bring in a circularity, and we have to think right from the very first conception of what people are producing. How is it going to be recycled and reprocessed? And then, so that links again to regenerative farming. Again, Michael writes about regenerative farming. It has the potential to put carbon back into the soil and many other benefits. So that's kind of using fewer manufactured fertilizers and agrotoxins and things like that. The big jump in the so-called green revolution after the Second World War. People just discovered all these chemicals, and these chemicals do wonderful things for agricultural production, but sometimes they can deplete the soil or obviously poison the soil. If you get too many phosphates or too many nitrates on the soil actually is less productive than if it was a stronger soil which has been regenerated by humus or by proper composting. And so this regenerative farming is a new way of saying, how do we actually enrich the soil without using manufactured chemicals?
Bernadette says, thank you for the presentation. Some beer and glass Coke bottles can be returned for deposits.
Okay, that still happens. Okay, I've been out of here, South Africa, for some time, and I know nothing about beer bottles.
Yeah.
And I don't drink Coke.
So we've hit 8 o'clock, and I think we should just be quite strict about sticking to the time. But Peter, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. And we appreciate your time and your effort. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. And I thank you all for being here. And let's look for signs of hope. I mean, it's not just, it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.
Great. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Father Grant Tangay will do the last of the lectures in the series. So 7 o'clock next week. Thank you very much.
Good night. God bless everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.